Bilateral tensions between the United States and China appear to have reached an all-time high. For months, the two major powers have been locked in an ongoing trade war, military friction in the South China Sea, and they've been blaming each other for causing the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the past week, the situation escalated to the point of Washington handing a Chinese consulate in Houston a 72-hour notice to close down, accusing it of spying on America. Beijing responded in kind, having the U.S. consulate in Chengdu lower its flag and leave. Has their relationship hit the lowest point in their diplomatic history? And can the situation actually get worse? To discuss this, we have joining us today Dr. Wang Jiangyu, Professor at the City University of Hong Kong School of Law. Hello, Dr. Wang. How are you today?
Hi, Su Yang. It's great. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you on. Well, we also connect with Dr. Joseph Bosco, former China Country Director in the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense. Hello, Dr. Bosco. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Su Yang. Very nice to see you, of course.
Well, my first question goes to you, Dr. Wang. Now, some say that we're already witnessing a second Cold War. Would you agree with this? Do you think this is actually the worst U.S.-China relations that have been to date?
I would agree with the second part of your characterization, but not yet the first one. So the second part is we are indeed into the worst U.S.-China relations since the PRC and the U.S. established the diplomatic relations. This is the period. You can see tremendous mistrust between the two countries. But whether it is Cold War, it depends on how do you define Cold War. If you define Cold War as kind of a state of affairs on the global stage, that the world is divided into two camps. In the old days, it's the Soviet camp and the Western camp, and with two parallel markets. They don't trade with each other, and they don't interact with each other. This is not yet a Cold War because the U.S. and China are economically heavily interdependent on each other, and both countries are fully integrated into the global market. So it's actually very difficult for them to be separated from each other to establish two camps for a Cold War. So it's too early to see that. And of course, I hope the world will never be like that again.
Oh, so they're too intertwined to decouple as of yet. Well, the same question goes to you, Dr. Bosco. Do you think the US and China are already locked in a Cold War?
Yes, I very much like Dr. Wang's analysis. I agree with him that relations are at the lowest point they've been in probably in the entire at least 40 years of engagement, if not going back earlier. But I do not necessarily agree that we are not in what we would call a Cold War situation. Again, it depends on how it's defined, as Dr. Wang says. I would define it as being an across-the-board ideological struggle for a way of life and a way of governing that are in competition with each other around the world. It's true that we have interlocking economic relations, but for decades now, China has been waging, I believe, a unilateral Cold War against the West. And it's only been in the last few years that the Trump administration has decided that enough is enough and that the West needs to respond. That challenge has been occurring not only in trade, but in information warfare, in military potential confrontations in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, in the issues surrounding Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. It's been one issue after another, intellectual property theft. And I think, again, depending on the definition, by my definition, we are definitely in a Cold War situation. We have been for quite some time, and it's only now that the United States is responding to the challenge from China.
Tensions and accusations that you mentioned, they have been escalating very conspicuously in recent months. And well, Dr. Wang, the US and a number of EU countries have been criticizing China's recent security law regarding Hong Kong, human rights issues, and they're even pulling out from using Chinese technology. What is Beijing's response to all this?
I think Beijing is using its traditional arguments on those issues. The first one is those issues are domestic issues. They are governed by China's own sovereignty. So it's not something for other countries to criticize, to interfere with. That's the perspective from international law. And from international relations, I think the Chinese understanding or the Chinese perception is there's nothing new here. Those are excuses for the U.S. and its followers to contain China. I think the U.S. is very much afraid of losing its #1 position on the world stage, and it must be the world #1 forever. It cannot be afforded to be the #2, even though, according to the Chinese understanding, it has no intention to challenge the U.S. It has been focusing on its own domestic development, but the U.S. just cannot see China to grow up to be a strong power. So I think those are the two Chinese understandings on those issues and on the Western criticisms.
And Dr. Wang, the Chinese state-run Global Times, that paper has been citing experts who said that the possibility of direct China-US military conflicts or even the severance of diplomatic ties are becoming even greater. Would you say that this is an indirect warning from Beijing? And do you think that military conflict is a real possibility?
Let me do a two-level analysis here. First one is you really cannot treat Global Times very serious. It is just one of the newspapers in China. It's one of the state-owned newspapers, but there are so many state-owned newspapers in China. It has whatever the Global Times say, there's always some international attention, probably because Global Times has always been very provocative and appeared to be nationalistic. But I don't think Global Times' view represents the mainstream view among Chinese media here, and let alone the official position of China. So that's one level of the analysis. But on the other hand, I agree with Dr. Bosco that because of the differences, the disputes, disagreements between the two countries, we have seen signs of confrontations everywhere. And so the military confrontation on a small scale would be possible given that the warships of both countries are in the South China Sea, and they are actually very close to each other. They are provoking each other. So there could be a very low level of military confrontation in the future. But in the long run, I don't think military. I don't think that would involve into whatever kind of war, because I think the leaders of the two countries are still reasonable people, and they know what would happen if a war broke out between the two strongest countries in the world, and they are both nuclear powers. So the big wars, I don't think that's possible. But the military confrontations of a small scale, which it could be possible.
Well, Dr. Bosco, how do you see the possibility of possible military conflict?
I entirely agree with Dr. Wang. I think that there is a possibility of a clash of some kind of miscalculation or adventurism by some commander. We had incidents like this in the past, of course. In 2001, the EP-3 incident, where a Chinese fighter pilot got too close to a reconnaissance U.S. plane, and it crashed. The pilot was killed, and the U.S. plane was destroyed. That could have escalated. Both sides showed caution and did not let the thing get out of hand. The difference now is that we've had a history of Chinese ships harassing not only U.S. ships, but ships of other nations as well, coming close, almost causing a collision, and firing, using their radar to lock onto these ships, using water cannons, various hostile acts. And until now, the U.S. and others have not retaliated. I'm afraid we're reaching the point where the U.S. Navy is not going to tolerate that kind of interference with its freedom of navigation operations. And you may well see a retaliation. The question then will be, what will both sides do? Will China, if the U.S. takes a hostile act in response to a Chinese act, will China then escalate and try something even more serious? This is when things could get a bit out of hand.
And Dr. Wang, what are the dangers of these tensions escalating even further?
Can you repeat the question again?
What do you think are the dangers of tensions between the U.S. and China escalating even further?
I think things will get. I think things will get better before they get worse. Even though there is a Cold War, as defined by Dr. Bosco, I think they are just started. The two countries have just started their confrontations, their competition. I would say use this word, confrontation on many fronts: ideological front, on technology, military, trade war, all those issues. They are just started. They could evolve into even more serious confrontations in the future. But we also have to understand that those confrontations, so the clash between U.S. and China, actually there are many limits to it. One thing is these two economies are highly interdependent on each other. They really cannot be separated from each other in the foreseeable future. Otherwise, both countries kind of their living standard will be seriously worsened, deteriorated. So and also both are nuclear powers. So an all-out war between these two countries is seriously not possible. And also. We also have to look at the nature of the two systems. Although China has been blamed for being very aggressive in recent years, being aggressive, assertive in recent years, and some people say that China and Chinese President Xi Jinping, China is going back, is reversing its reform and opening up. That is actually not the case, because the many measures have been adopted in China indicates that so China is actually continuing its reform and opening up, meaning that the Chinese economy is continuing open to international trade and investment. So which basically means, and on the other hand, the U.S. economy is also an open economy. So if they are both open to the whole world, it's not possible for them to establish, two camps which do not trade with each other, do not interact with each other. So I don't think so. The structure of the international system, especially the international economic system, would determine that a new Cold War, a very kind of the West, the Soviet-style Cold War, would emerge again. But the confrontations, before that, the confrontation, before the two countries realized it's really important for them to have peaceful and stable relations, the confrontations will actually break out on many fronts, and even to a more serious stage.
And Dr. Bosco, do you think there can be a compromise between the two countries?
One would certainly hope so, and there can be accommodations to each other's core interests, vital interests. But one has to keep in mind that we've had a process for the last 40 years of the U.S. and the West more or less accommodating China's rise and not challenging it on human rights or Taiwan or East China Sea or South China Sea, all these issues that we've been talking about. The West's perception is we've been very indulgent, very tolerant, We've waited for China to enter the family of nations, as Nixon called it, to moderate its policies, not only internationally, but at home with its own people. And instead, we see this very harsh crackdown on Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs, on human rights generally, as well as very aggressive moves in the South China Sea and East China Sea. So it's hard to envision how one can compromise unless China comes to its senses and realizes that this is not the best path for Chinese development, for China's role in the world, and is willing to back away from these very aggressive postures. Then I think we can reach an accommodation on some of these other issues.
And Dr. Wang, how do you see this? Do you think there can be a compromise, or do you think the situation has become too politicized?
The situation has certainly been extremely politicized because the misunderstanding between these two countries has appeared to be so huge, and the mistrust has never been so strong. It's fair for the West, for the U.S., to require China to be more decentralized, deregulated, and more liberalized. And to a large extent, China is doing the same. But regarding Hong Kong and regarding many other issues, I think some of the criticisms are based on bias, misunderstanding, rather than I would believe the expectations, right? So hope China to become more open and the Chinese government to treat its people nicer. Those are legitimate and concerns based on good intentions. But many of those criticisms are also based on bias and based on misunderstanding. So and that's why it's so important for the government officials, for the people, for scholars to talk with each other, and like what we are doing now. So otherwise things will definitely get even worse and worse in the not very long future before they got better.
So it looks like we have two vastly different ideologies, but very interlinked economies that almost makes it impossible to decouple. I suppose we'll have to see what happens down the road as usual, but I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up the discussion here. It was wonderful speaking with you both. That was Dr. Wang Jiangyu, Professor at the City University of Hong Kong School of Law, and Dr. Joseph Bosco, former China Country Director in the US Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thank you both so much for joining the programme.
Thank
you very much.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with more global insights on issues making headlines. Have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.